Welcome everyone to the Planning Committee today. We'll run through the agenda. Apologies for absence, anyone?
Chair, we've had apologies from Councillor Lubbock and Councillor Stootley. We are still waiting for Councillors Young and Champion, I believe, who are en route.
Thank you.
The rules are, though, that if you're not here for an entire item, you cannot vote on that. So I will remind them if they arrive late. Thank you.
Okay, declarations for interest. Anyone? Councillor Davis?
Item 4C, 44 York Street. I'm predetermined.
Thank you.
Just to remind members, if a member is predetermined, that means that they may speak as a member of the public on that item, although you've not registered to do that, but if you wish to, you could, but then you would need to leave the room while members make their decision. Thank you.
Councillor Sands?
On the count of, I know Mr Miles because I used to teach the school where his daughters attended and know him well, and he's speaking today.
Sorry, Councillor Sands, which item was that? That was York Street again? Is it another interest or is it predetermined? So it's an other interest, you just want it recorded that you actually know the applicant, but because you taught the school. Thank you. That will be recorded, but that doesn't affect your ability to determine that application.
Okay, minutes of last meeting. Councillor Graham?
Interest, but I think Councillor Young's apologies were missed.
Oh, sorry. Thank you.
Minutes of last meeting. Do we agree they're correct record? Thank you. We'll move on to planning application now, and we will start with 4A on the list, and that's St Peter's Methodist Church, Park Lane. And I'll ask our planning officer over here if she can take us through the report. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. This application proposes amendments to the approved plans of a previous permission at St Peter's Methodist Church on Park Lane. That permission is for the conversion of 3 existing buildings on the site to a total of 20 dwellings with associated works. Members may recall that application being considered previously, and it was also subject to an appeal hearing. Work to implement the permission that was granted began in 2020 and is now nearing completion. This application only proposes amendments to the approved scheme. In determining this application, we can only give consideration to the amendments which are proposed within it. It's not possible to revisit the scheme as a whole or consider the principle again. The site is at a prominent position on the junction between Park Lane and Avenue Road. The building here is the main church building that was on the site. It's a 1930s building. When that was constructed, it replaced an earlier 19th century Edward Boardman chapel in this area here. That building was retained on site and altered throughout the 20th century for use as a church hall. The third building on the site is a smaller single-storey detached building here, which was used by the Boys Brigade. The streets surrounding the site are characterised by 2-storey terraces, largely in red brick and buff brick. The nearest neighbours to the site are those to the north, fronting Park Lane here, and fronting along Doris Road and Avenue Road, and a number of those dwellings have views from the rear from windows and from gardens of the site. The closest neighbouring dwellings are the one which immediately abuts the north boundary at 79 Park Lane and 77 Park Lane beyond that. So within the site you've got the 3 buildings, the church hall and the Boys Brigade. The approval converted these to a total of 20 dwellings, which consisted of a single 2-bed dwelling within the Boys Brigade building, 8 dwellings within the church across 4 floors, and within the church hall there is to be 11 units across 4 floors. They're a mixture of flats and townhouses. Across the remainder of the site, there's some parking spaces across the frontage to Park Lane. The spaces between the buildings are proposed for communal amenity space, with also some bin and cycle storage provided. And there's landscaping proposed across the site, details of which have been provided within this application. There are no changes within the application to the number of units to be provided or the form or internal layout of them. It's external design changes which are to be considered. So looking at those proposed design changes, I'll go through a series of elevations. On the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see the approved elevations. So that's what the extant permission is for and can be implemented. And on the left-hand side, we've got the proposals which are subject to this application. So on the Boys Brigade building, there was an approval, or the approval contained a roof terrace at the rear of the building. The proposal retains that, but proposes a slight alteration to the form of the balustrade, where the junction would be between a glass balustrade around it and the original roof to the building. The other proposed change on this building is the position of solar panels from across the top of the roof slope down to the bottom. And you can see the proposed change to the balustrade around the roof terrace a bit more clearly on this rear elevation. So the proposal was always for the 1.7 metre high obscure glass balustrades to be 1.7 metres from the floor level. During construction, there's been a slight adjustment to the floor level, so to retain the height of the balustrade to protect the privacy of both users of the roof terrace and neighbours around the site. That now projects just above the roof line there, so the proposal just cuts the corner off to create a neater junction. You'll see that in following photos. On the main church building, this is the south elevation which faces Avenue Road. There are a few changes proposed here, and the application also has included details of solar panels to be provided across the roof slope in accordance with the requirements of a condition of the original permission. One of the most significant changes on this elevation and within the application as a whole relates to some stained glass. So there's existing stained glass in these two openings, and the approval was to remove the stained glass from those two window openings and relocate it in new window openings on the north and west elevations. The existing openings there would be reglazed and doors would be provided to access this small roof terrace. The proposal is now to retain that existing stained glass in situ and to insert a new door between the two window openings onto that approved roof terrace. So that stained glass would remain where it is and where it has always been. There was also a roof terrace proposed across the remainder of this larger flat roof section here to provide roof terraces to 3 of the dwellings, and existing window openings are approved to be altered to door openings to give access onto that roof terrace. The amended proposal omits that roof terrace entirely from this larger section and keeps the window openings as they are, rather than altering them to doors. An additional detail has been added on this elevation just to provide steps to this upper ground floor door. So the door was approved, but no access to the external area was shown. And there's also been the addition of a number of flues, vents and extracts across the elevation to serve the new dwellings. On the north elevation, so on the opposite side of this building, the elevation which faces within the site, an approved roof terrace was also included to a flat roof on this side of the building, and the proposal retains it as part of the proposal. The approval was to raise the brick parapet by a few courses and then provide an obscure glass balustrade above that. The proposal is to retain the parapet at the original height and provide a larger balustrade above it, and that would be clear glass rather than obscure glazed. At the time of writing the report, there was some uncertainty about that, but I can confirm the proposal is for that glass to be clear. One of the openings where the stained glass was proposed to be relocated from the south elevation was this new opening here on the north elevation. Now the stained glass is proposed to remain in situ. That's been reduced to a smaller window opening, and that's to a stairwell. Another window here to a stairwell on the floor below is proposed to be omitted from the proposal. There's an area which you can see shaded in a different colour at the bottom of the elevation here. That's where there's been some demolition and the original brickwork isn't in a good state of repair, so it's proposed to be faced with brick slips. Brick slips are sort of a slice of the front of face of a brick which has been cut off and applied to the face of the building to cover over the brickwork, so it appears to be as if it were a full brick. There's also an area here where some heritage interpretation is proposed. And there's another panel on the opposite elevation and other places within the external areas of the site and also internally within the building where artefacts and plaques are found during construction and within the development are proposed to be displayed. On this elevation there's also an original chimney on the building that was proposed to be, that the approval included retention of that, and the proposal is to remove it. Moving round to the east elevation, the principal elevation of this 1930s church building, which faces that road junction between Park Lane and Avenue Road, there were no significant changes proposed or contained in the approval for this elevation other than replacing window frames on the ground floor, and there are no proposed amendments to that. You can just see the consequential impacts of changes on the other elevations here. And then moving round to the rear elevation to the west. Again, this is the other position where stained glass was proposed to be moved from the south elevation. That would have been a new window opening. Now the stained glass is retained in situ. There's no new window opening there, and that would have been to a stairwell. A further window has been omitted, which would have been to a living room here. There's no window proposed there. That was one of two windows to that room, so there'd just be the single window to the living room. And then there's been a slight rearrangement of the position of doors and windows on the ground floor in this area. Then I'll just run you through the floor plans to show where those changes are. This is the lower ground floor where you've just got a rearrangement of the position of approved window and door openings. To the floor above that, so this is the living room, which was to have two windows and now has one. And then on the first floor, access to the terrace along the north side of the building would be via these small staircases from the first floor up through the floor of the terrace to access that, which means on the second floor, rather than altering existing windows to door openings, you've got access through the floor via those small staircases. The reason for that change is due to structural difficulties in providing the door openings, cutting through the existing construction. And the third building on the site is the church hall. The approval for this included the construction of a pitched roof extension over an existing two-storey flat roof extension at the rear of the original building. You can see the ridge height of that extension stepped down from the ridge over the original building. This application proposes reducing that step down in height, and the ridge height of the extension would be 0.9 metres higher than was approved. There's also a slight adjustment to the eaves height on this side of the building. There's also been a slight adjustment to the size and position of roof lights, and these roof lights and new windows in the extension and windows in the original building are all proposed to be obscure glazed and on restricted openings, so the restrictors would mean that they could only open 50 millimetres. Other changes on this elevation include changes to the roof lights. So there were these two banks of rows of roof lights. The bottom row would provide light over a void down into the first floor accommodation, and the upper row would provide roof lights to second floor bedrooms. The proposal removes the first floor roof lights and reduces the size of those to the second floor. And I think the final change on this elevation is to these original window openings. It was thought that they just had square heads in the original openings. Now some work has been undertaken on site. It's found that they are in fact rounded, so the proposal is to fully glaze those within the rounded shape. Then on the south elevation of the building, the approval showed a bank of solar panels across the top of the roof set back from the front face of the building, and also rows of solar panels across the roof of the extension. The application proposes one single row across the top of the original roof slope. There are similar changes to the roof lights on this roof slope. So again, smaller roof lights to second floor bedrooms and just one roof lights to the first floor there. The others have been omitted. The same changes to the original openings to fully glaze those up to the rounded heads, and some minor alterations to the size and proportions of windows in the extension. And again, you can see that difference in the height of the extension. So rather than dropping down 1.2 metres from the ridge of the original building, that step down is now reduced to 0.3 metres. There's a further area here on this building where brick slips are proposed to be applied over the original brickwork. Then looking at the east elevation of this building, so it was originally an Edward Boardman chapel that was constructed in the 19th century, but later significantly altered in the 20th century, including the provision of a solid brick facade over this east elevation in the 1960s. Although this elevation on the right-hand side of the screen was approved, it wasn't known what would be behind that 1960s facade when it was removed and what might remain of the original 19th century features. So although this was approved, it was largely indicative. Now that demolition of the 1960s facade has taken place, this is the proposal for that east elevation. Demolition discovered that the original Gothic stone tracery window still remained. The stained and leaded glass was largely removed. There were only small fragments left, but the stonework itself remained, as did a round window above that. So the proposal is to reinstate those features by providing new glazing throughout the stonework in timber frames and infilling small sections above that with render. The round window at the top would also be infilled with render. 2 new windows to the side at first floor level are proposed, and they're in the positions and roughly follow the shape of original openings that were there but had been infilled. And the whole face of the building is proposed to be refaced with brick slips and the corners here and virgin coping reinstated. The approval included a zinc-clad porch to the front, and the amended proposal still incorporates that largely as previously approved. And then on the rear west elevation, here you can see the difference in the form and height of the extension. So it was proposed to drop down and follow the line of the roof of the original building. The proposal increases the height of it and also alters the eaves line, so you've got this asymmetric gable. The approval was to cover that extension in zinc cladding, and the proposal retains that. There's another area where brick slips are proposed over damaged brickwork at ground floor level. There have been some minor changes to the size and proportions of the windows on this elevation, and the approval included 2 devices to mitigate some of the impacts of overlooking from these windows. One was some sections of obscure glazing, which are shown in the shading to the bottom of these 3 windows. That's been omitted from the proposal, but the other device that was proposed to be used was setting the windows back in deep reveals to mitigate the views out to the sides. And those deep reveals are now proposed across all of the windows on the upper floors of this elevation. Just looking at the lower ground floor plan, there are no significant changes here. But moving up to the ground floor, the approval included ground floor windows in the front elevation here, either side of the porch, which would have given additional light in addition to side elevation windows to these 2 ground floor living rooms, which are part of 3-bedroom dwellings. The proposal omits those front elevation windows and just retains the side elevation ones, and that means that on the northern side, 1 window here would have a view out directly to the brick gable wall of 79 Park Lane, the neighbouring dwelling. The other window is proposed to be obscure glazed, and all these side elevation windows are in original openings which are set quite high above the floor level, so the view out is just looking upwards. On the first floor, within those same units, these bedrooms would have had roof lights in addition to the window openings. Those roof lights have been omitted, so they just have, the front bedrooms have 2 windows to the front and to the side, but the bedroom to the back just has the side elevation windows, and that means on the northern side here that would be an obscure glazed window to mitigate the overlooking to neighbours, and that would now be the only opening to that bedroom. Living rooms in the two units behind those would also lose the first floor roof lights and just have the side elevation windows, which again means in this living room the two windows would be obscure glazed. And then up on the second floor, those units would have small roof lights over the bedrooms, and they're smaller than was contained in the approval. So moving on now to some photos of the site, and starting with what the site looked like before the development. So this was a photo taken back in 2018. This is when the congregation had vacated the site. But here you can see the original 1930s church building, and at this time the porch was just being supported with some timbers because there were some structural issues with that. And beyond that you can see the solid brick face that had been applied to the church hall in the 1960s. And this is a view from a similar position today, now that work has started implementing that 2018 planning permission. Works to stabilise the church porch have been undertaken and completed, and works have started to demolish and reveal the original facade to the church hall, and I'll go through that in more detail. Just looking again at the church, here you can see this. Other than new window frames in the ground floor windows, it remains as it was and in accordance with the approval. You can see that some tree planting here has already been implemented during the course of works. And then just moving along further to the side, this is standing in the junction with Mill Hill Road, looking into the site. On the north elevation of the church here, you can see where that roof terrace has been provided with the clear glass balustrade. Below that, original window openings have had new frames fitted, which you'll see in the following photo, and this is the area where some changes are proposed to the position and extent of window openings. And this is just a close-up of the new aluminium window frames which have been fitted within the church and are also proposed within the church hall. You can see where they've got opening lights at the top with frames protruding out around the remainder of the face of the frame, and then at the bottom you can see where there are these solid panels rather than glazing. That's where internally there's a floor construction which crosses through the original window opening, so those solid panels just block out any view of that floor behind. Moving round to the south elevation, here you can see the solar panels at the top of the roof. There are a number of pigeons on the roof in this photo, but there are also a number of flues there, and you can see positions of extracts dotted around the face of the building. Again, you can see the new aluminium window frames in the original openings, and a new door opening with steps down to amenity space outside. As well as this tree planting which has already been implemented, there is a soft landscape scheme for the whole of the site, and that includes some hedge planting and shrubs along this boundary with grass to the surface, and other planting proposed throughout the remainder of the site. This is the area of flat roof where the approval included a roof terrace to 3 of the dwellings, but that's now not proposed to be implemented, so will remain as it currently appears. And this is the lower section of roof where an approved roof terrace has been provided. Just moving down, this is standing on Avenue Road looking into the site. This is the Boys Brigade building, which is now largely complete, and this is just a small area where you can see the junction between the balustrade to the roof terrace and the roof slope itself, where a small amendment is proposed. And then standing back on Avenue Road, you can see the front of the Boys Brigade building there. And on the church, you can see these 2 sections of stained glass, which are proposed to remain in this position, and that's the original position of that stained glass. You can also just see the rear elevation of the church, which is largely complete, and in the background, the extension which has been built over the rear of the church hall. Then just moving round to the side, coming to the rear of the site, You can see the solar panels at the bottom of the roof slope here rather than their approved position at the top on the Boys Brigade. And again, you can see the extension over the church hall. And from this position, you can see those deep reveal window openings which have been provided within the extension. And then coming round right to the back of the site, standing in the access way between the back of the terrace along Doris Road on this side and Avenue Road on this side. Looking at the church building first, you can see another area of stained glass. This was always contained in the approval to remain in its original position, so there's no change there. But the approval included the insertion of a large new window opening here to take one section of the stained glass from the south elevation. Now that stained glass is remaining in situ. There's no proposal for a new window there, so that section of wall will remain as you see it. On the extension over the church hall here, you can see the zinc cladding to it, those deep window reveals on the upper floors, and this is the position where you can just see that asymmetric gable to the roof with higher eaves on the south side than the north side. And you can also see the ridge line just in relation to the coping along the top of the original roof slope there. Then moving around to the north of the site, this is standing within a neighbouring garden looking back to the site, and this was taken when there was still construction ongoing and scaffolding around the extension to the church hall. But from this position you can see the ridge over the extension here, which is 0.9 metres higher than the approved position, and you can see that there's just a modest step down from the roof over the original building here. This photo was taken within the garden of the property, but there is a window to a kitchen which was taken sort of just behind where the photo was taken, and from that kitchen window you have a very similar view of the extension. There are two windows at first floor level here within the extension, and they're proposed to be both obscure glazed and have those restricted openings to mitigate any overlooking in this direction. The roof lights within the roof slope here of the extension would also be obscure glazed. And then standing back within the application site, this is on the north side with the north elevation of the church hall to the side and the gable wall of 79 Park Lane on the boundary here. This dwelling has an existing conservatory to the rear, and there's an extant planning permission to replace that with a single-storey flat roof extension, and that would extend right up to the boundary wall with the application site. In that shared wall, there would be a high-level window, and within the flat roof of the extension, there would be 4 roof lights. All the windows along this elevation are proposed to be both obscure glazed and have restricted openings, and you can see an example of the obscuration to the glazing in this bathroom window which has been completed here. On this photo you can also see the original brickwork to the church hall. You can see it's quite a muted grey colour as it's weathered with age. The bricks have quite a hard surface finish and square edges, and the mortar lines between the courses of bricks are quite fine and a similar colour to the bricks themselves. For reference, this is just an image of the original church hall building on the site in the 19th century. You can see the Gothic stone tracery window here with the round window above it and windows to each side, and the substantial porch and other ecclesiastical features on the frontage. That was lost in the 1960s, and at the time of considering the original application we didn't know how much of that might remain on site. Following demolition of the 1960s facade, this is what the building currently looks like. So that stone tracery window was revealed and largely intact, although the glazing had been removed. And the proposal is now to reglaze that. The round window above it was also revealed, but for construction and safety reasons, rather than glazing that, it's proposed to be infilled with render. You can see that construction has started on the new porch to the front of the building there, and the whole face of the building has been covered in brick slips which have been tinted to appear aged. On the the south elevation, you can just see the solar panels across the top of the roof and the roof lights below that. and the original window openings along the side elevation, which have those rounded heads that are proposed to be fully glazed now. Here's just another view of that elevation to show the significance of that stone tracery window and the appearance of the brick slips as they currently appear. And then moving into looking a bit more detail here, you can see the intricate shapes to the stonework around the window and how the new covering of brick slips has gone up to the stonework and how that's been detailed around there, and the verge has been reinstated with a new coping and will be completed at the apex there in due course. So the proposal for this window is to provide new glazing within timber frames throughout these sections, and just to infill these smaller shaped sections with render to match the round window above. And this photo here, taken at the front corner of the building, just shows the difference between the brick slips which have been applied to the front and the original brickwork to the side here. There is a contrast between the two, with the brick slips being much rougher in their surface finish, having rounder edges, and you can see that the mortar lines are much deeper between the rows of bricks, and the mortar itself is a much brighter colour. In order to mitigate some of the impact of that, it's proposed to tint the mortar where brick slips have been used, and it would be tinted to match this sample that has been applied on this section. So the whole of the front of the building would have the appearance of this section here. So that's what's proposed. In terms of the assessment, as set out in your report, the application proposes amendments to the approved scheme for this site for the conversion of the 3 historic buildings to 20 dwellings. It's only the amendments which are proposed in this application that can be considered. We cannot revisit the principle or overall form of the development, as that has an extant planning permission. In design and heritage terms, some aspects of this proposal, such as the aluminium windows and the window design to the church and church hall, and the brick slips and mortar to the church hall east elevation, are not considered to represent the highest quality solutions for these buildings. It is regrettable that alternative solutions have not been submitted and that these works have been implemented in advance of any approval being given. However, the proposals in this application also incorporate some amendments to the scheme which are beneficial in design and heritage terms. These include the retention of the south elevation stained glass in situ and omission of the roof terrace on the south elevation of this locally listed building. None of the amendments proposed are unacceptable individually in design and heritage terms and are balanced by the more beneficial aspects of the proposal. The overall effect doesn't unacceptably diminish the design quality of the approved scheme or result in any harm to heritage assets that is not outweighed by the public benefits of the development. Increasing the height of the church hall extension has attracted objections to this application. Daylight and sunlight assessments identify that an extension of this height has a greater impact on neighbouring occupiers than the approved extension. However, the assessments demonstrate that there would be no loss of light or overshadowing to windows and gardens that would be unacceptably harmful or breach building research establishment guidance. It is not considered that there would be any additional unacceptable overlooking or loss of privacy, subject to a condition securing the provision of obscure glazing and opening restrictors on windows which do have the potential to overlook. The amendments also compromise the amenity of future occupiers of the development itself by removing private terraces, which increases the pressure on communal amenity spaces, and by reducing natural light and outlook to some of the units in the church hall as a result of alterations to windows and roof lights. It is not considered that the standard of amenity in any single dwelling or to the overall scheme would be unacceptable, and future residents would be aware of the constraints prior to their occupation. As well as proposing amendments to the design, the application also seeks to satisfy the requirements of some of the conditions of the existing permission. The submissions that have been made demonstrate that more than 10% of the development's energy requirements can be provided by the proposed solar panels. Acceptable BAT mitigation and enhancement would be provided. A soft and hard landscape scheme would complement the appearance of the development and enhance amenity spaces and biodiversity. Adequate bin and cycle storage would be provided, and heritage interpretation would retain artefacts on site and inform residents and the public of the site's history. Overall, the amended scheme and additional submissions are considered to be acceptable, and the proposal is recommended for approval, subject to the conditions listed in the report. Thank you.
Thank you, Lorraine, for a comprehensive report there. Any questions? Councillor Sands.
Thank you, Chair. A couple of questions, if I may. I think it was between the first floor and the second floor in part of the plan, there were some stairs included. They may have been in the original application. They seem to be those funny sort of left-right stairs. If they are they deemed a safe sort of addition? And also again, this doesn't change things, but the solar panels, who on the site benefits from the solar panels? And last question, if I may, where you mentioned the conservatory, will that create a party wall, and is that a separate planning application?
On the stairs and the safety of those, that would be a matter to satisfy building regulations rather than planning. As far as the application is proposed, it retains access up to that roof terrace for occupants of those users, and we're satisfied that that's an acceptable solution. From the solar panels, the information that's been submitted demonstrates that they would provide at least 10% of the each building's energy requirements. How that's distributed to occupants is something I don't know. It is a matter for the developer. And in terms of the party wall and the extension to the neighbouring property, there is planning permission for that extension. It has been through an application process and been approved, and it would utilise the existing boundary between the two properties, and I know that there have been discussions between the neighbour and the developer on that.
Councillor Graham.
Thank you. I have a general and a very specific question. My general question is that there are lots of different things to consider there, and I wonder if we have to do all or nothing, or if we can take it in parts. And my very specific paragraph 34, and it's about the round window above the tracery that's going to be obscured, and it says it's for fire safety. Could you explain that, please?
On your first question, we have to consider the application as a whole, so we have to consider all the amendments together rather than looking at them individually. In the assessment, I have set out that some elements are considered less favourably than others, and some are improvements from the approved scheme. When we look at the scheme holistically as one proposal, then the officer opinion and the recommendation is that it's acceptable. On that round window on the church hall, which is the window here, within that front part of the church, it's subdivided down the middle into 2 units over 3 floors. So that's actually within sort of the loft space to the 2 units, there's a party wall that divides 2 units, and building regulations require that there's fire separation between the 2 units, so fire couldn't spread from one unit to another, which means there needs to be a solid partition between the 2, which the applicants have considered that rendering over that to obscure the appearance of that partition between the 2 units is the best option. That party wall also cuts through the window below and separates 2 staircases behind that window, but to block the use of the wall where that window is proposed to be glazed, the glazing would be obscured.
I'd like to come back later to how the loss of amenity how it was decided what was acceptable, because it seems to me there is quite considerable loss of daylight, loss of balcony access, loss of amenity for residents. So how was that decided, please?
We've looked at the effect on the units individually. They all retain windows which would provide some outlook and light, but it will be diminished from what was previously approved. looking at it as a proposal in its own rights. It's converting an historic building. The proposal has sought to limit the alteration and provision of new openings in order to conserve the historic appearance of the building, and we recognise that there are constraints when converting buildings of this type. The main thing is that future occupiers would be aware before they choose to rent or purchase one of the properties, and it is limited, but within the constraints of the site. If it were a new build, we'd perhaps be considering it differently and asking the applicants to improve, to do what they could in the design to improve the amenity, but within the constraints of this conversion, we're satisfied that it's acceptable and doesn't have any unacceptable impact on the overall development.
Councillor Davis.
Thank you. This is about section 106. When this was previously decided, I think it was discussed that if the viability changed, the section 106 obligations would be relooked at. Now, there are fewer windows, fewer roof lights, fewer balconies. So how does this affect the viability? And of course, house prices have gone up. How does this affect the viability and the section 106 obligations going forward?
Yes, so the Section 106 agreement on the original permission included a clause that if none of the units were occupied within 18 months of commencement, there would be a viability review. That period passed, and the viability review was undertaken earlier this year. So up-to-date information on the costs and values was submitted, and we considered that. There have been a lot of changes in both costs and values in that period, but it wasn't found that there was any additional surplus that could be contributed to affordable housing. The differences had been quite considerable, and there was no additional surplus that could be paid in the terms of the agreement.
And that's because the rising cost of materials.
Yeah.
Councillor Bergline.
Thank you. My question was also around the amenity space, so similar to what Councillor Graham asked. And I was just wondering whether you could confirm that all changes in reduction of windows and therefore daylight, as well as amenity space with regards to balconies, are due to site constraints. Are they all,
Yes, yeah. The loss of the balcony on the south elevation of the church is due to structural issues that they discovered when they started investigating the building more thoroughly. It was found that they couldn't cut through to create any access onto that side of the building, and that's the reason why the stairs are proposed rather than doors on the other side. And changes to windows and other openings are largely due to the constraints of converting these historic buildings and what they've found now that they've started work and investigated things more thoroughly.
Councillor Davis.
Thanks. Could I just ask about the extension? I mean, I think it looks out of scale now, and I also think the changes to the windows, I just don't think it looks right as a building. So what decisions were taken to deem those acceptable? Because it looks very different to the original agreed proposals.
Our view is that the changes to the overall design approach to the extension and the treatment of the church hall aren't that significant, and where they are different, then they remain appropriate within the context of this building and the surrounding area. The rear extension to the church hall was always going to be quite significant in scale, and they'd adopted this sort of complementary contemporary design approach rather than looking to replicate anything from the original building, and they've retained that within the proposal. Some of the changes to the window openings, so the changes on these original window openings to open them up to the original size and shape of those openings, we consider to be a benefit of the proposal to restore part of the original character. The frames which are proposed to be used, as I said, aren't perhaps the optimum solution, and we would have liked to have looked at others. But when we look at it in the context of the overall proposal with the restoration of the front elevation, then the character of the original building is restored. It's certainly an improvement on what was there prior to the development, and as a whole, if this application were proposed as a new application, if we hadn't had the previous proposal and we're just considering this as a fresh application, then in design and heritage terms we would consider the proposals to be acceptable.
Okay, we'll now move on to discussions. To pull that, the recommendation is to approve, and I'll move that. Without second, thank you, Councillor Sands. Mike. Any discussions, Councillor Sands?
I quite like the changes that have been made, and I'd like to commend the developers in retaining the stained glass window in situ, and also making a feature of the stone traced window that's been uncovered. I think it looks really, really nice.
Thank you. Anyone else? Councillor Davis and then Councillor Thomas Vaughan.
Yeah, I mean, I completely disagree with Councillor Sands. I don't think it looks nice at all. And I really am concerned about the loss of light now. There's so many windows and roof lights that have now been removed, and there's less amenity space because of which, understandably, if they can't build the roof terraces, then, that's understandable. But the loss of light is incredible compared to the first application.
Viv Thomas.
Thank you. I know that the obscure glazing and the restricted openings of the windows is less of an impact on the surrounding buildings. I think the heritage plaques are a positive, and the retainment of the stained glass, and also the tinted mortar to the brick slips, which will make the visual appearance more in keeping. And actually I feel that the original building, going back to when it was first built, probably is more of a sort of impact on the area than the current modern one. Thank you.
Councillor Bergman.
Thank you. I agree with Councillor Davis. I think it's concerning that quite a lot of amenity is lost through these new proposals. But I feel it's like within the planning framework that we're operating, because we have an approved application, and because there are positive aspects to the changes, and because there are site constraints, and also considering that building work has happened and that these site constraints were discovered after building work has happened. Although I'm very unhappy with the loss in amenity, I feel like there is no other option than still support it.
Councillor Peake.
Looking at the revised plans on this, I like the way they're keeping the glazed windows in the same place and keeping the Gothic effect that it's got. And I think it's better than what the last plan was myself.
There was no one else wish to say anything. We'll move straight to the vote. The recommendation is to approve. All those in favour, please
Chair,
show.
before we go to the vote, can I just remind Councillor Champion?
I think you realised.
Yes.
All those in favour, please show.
Okay, Chair, that is a recorded vote, so that's Councillors Driver, Councillor Sue Sands, Councillor Mike Sands, Councillor Bogerline, Councillor Thomas, Viv, Councillor Thomas Vaughan, Councillor Peake, and Councillor Graham voting in favour.
Against? Abstention.
Abstention, Councillor Davis abstaining.
Thank you. So,
I will recall Councillor Champion.
yeah.
Separate.
Thank you. So that's been approved. Thank you very much. And we move on now to our next one. And we'll just wait for the planners to move and the next one to come in, which is Gately Green.
Gately Gardens.
Gately Gardens.
We have two speakers, but we don't have an agent or applicant. Can I just check, we don't have the agent or applicant for Gately Gardens? So, Chair, we have two speakers for this item.
Okay.
Mr Darren Link will be speaking on behalf of residents, and Councillor Kendrick.
Thank you very much. Stephen, when you're ready, you can take us through the report. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. This is planning application at 3 Gately Gardens, which is for the construction of a 2-storey side extension, which facilitates the use of the dwelling as a 5-bed house of multiple occupancy, HMO. To set the scene, 3 Gately Gardens is located to the south side of the cul-de-sac. The cul-de-sac is accessed by Woodcock Road to the south. There are 17 dwellings within the cul-de-sac. And this plan shows the existing block plan that shows the dwelling arranged over its original L-shaped footprint, which includes a projecting 2-storey gable section to the front. To the side is the existing single-storey flat roof garage that's attached to the dwelling, with a driveway and garden to the front and a garden to the rear. This is the existing plans that shows the layout, which has 3 bedrooms on the first floor, and the elevation there shows the existing gable design to the front. The proposed 2-storey extension would follow the form of the existing gable, so it would be built to the same design and scale, with ridges that would match, eaves heights that would match. It would also come forward to the same building line to the front of the site. It would be built to the edge of the site, with the boundary with the neighbouring property located on this side. One tweak to the design to mention that's happened during the determination, there is a door serving a store to the front that has been redesigned to make sure that it doesn't appear as a second entrance, so it's just a door that is serving as a store for the occupants of the house. The property would be arranged with the bedrooms on the first floor as before, and also some bedrooms on the ground floor. Moving on to show you the photograph. So this is the subject property with the garage that is to go to the side, and the nearest neighbouring property to the side there, number 4. So in terms of our assessment, it's very important to stress that the parts of the proposal that we're actually able to apply thought to in determination are the impacts of the proposal in terms of design and residential amenity. And note that there have been a number of concerns raised by the representations received from neighbours that cite concerns relating to the use of the property as a small-scale HMO. So it's very important to stress that the proposed use of the dwelling as a small-scale HMO with 5 bedrooms is a form of permitted development. So that's to say that that part of the proposal does not require planning permission. Unless rights have been removed previously, typical dwellings could convert to use as an HMO, a small-scale HMO, at any point without needing prior consent from the council. A change of use to a large-scale HMO is only required once there is a proposal for 7 or more bedrooms. So in terms of the impacts we're looking at, we are focusing primarily on the design of the proposal in terms of how it fits in with the character of the area, and the amenity impacts in terms of overshadowing, loss of light, privacy, outlook, and so on. So in terms of the concerns that we are considering, our focus for amenity issues primarily relate to the relationship with number 4 to the side. So we acknowledge that there will be some noticeable changes to the current situation by virtue of the 2-storey side extension being constructed to the side of the dwelling up to the boundary located here. But we will note from the photographs collected on the site visit that the side elevation of number 4 features a window serving the hallway, a window to the rear that's serving the kitchen, and a window on the first floor that serves a landing. Each of these windows are either secondary windows that provide a secondary source of light to a space, or they are just serving secondary living spaces. So that's to say they're living spaces that aren't the main functioning parts of the dwelling, such as a living room or a kitchen or a bedroom. So the kitchen to the rear has another window, a secondary window that's located here that's providing lots of light to the kitchen. The hallway to the front has a window from the door that brings it light, and the landing would be classed as a secondary living space. In terms of the impacts, you can note from the pictures that there is a stepped building line. So if I go back a couple of photographs to the wider street scene, you should hopefully be able to see that number 4 and the properties beyond are stepped back slightly from the building line of number 3, which is stepped forward. So therefore, the majority of the impact is on this side section of the dwelling, and the bit projecting forward is primarily where the driveway is. So in terms of overshadowing and outlook being overbearing, we don't consider that those impacts are significant. We do obviously acknowledge that there's a change of the current situation, but they're not reasons that we feel we could refuse the application for. Pictures to the rear hopefully illustrate that as well, to show that there would be some noticeable gap that would remain between the application site and the neighbouring property. It's just another view. In terms of design, return you to the front view. In terms of design, we feel that the proposal, in the way that it matches and follows the form of the existing, is not considerably, would not result in significant harm being caused to the character of the surrounding area. The other neighbouring property is of the same design, and it sits on close to the bend on the entrance into the cul-de-sac, where you would have a pair of properties. You would have a pair of properties with the same gable design that would then be carried on. There is a varied character within the cul-de-sac. There's predominantly dwellings of a semi-detached design, of variation similar to this. So we don't feel that the design in itself would cause significant harm to the character and appearance of the area. Other things to note, we would add a condition, should this be approved, requiring biodiversity enhancements by virtue of the roof being worked on and enlarged. There's a couple of other points also to note. There were a couple of issues with the report, the way it's been presented within the agenda. Within the section referring to the issues, the numbers were incorrectly listed, and there was also an issue with regard to letters being sent to neighbours. There was a letter sent initially that didn't include the time of the committee, so letters were checked and resent at a later date by our department. I think that is covering everything. Just then to return you to the plans, and that was everything. Thank you.
Stephen?
Stephen, just the St Cat Grove Warden.
Yeah, sorry, that was the other point. Yeah, I should have mentioned that. So the report initially referred to it as being an Eton ward. It is in fact in Catton Grove ward.
Okay, brilliant. We've got a couple of speakers. First one is Mr. Ling.
That's one, I think. Thank you. It's Mr. Link. That's fine. Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Today I represent 10 households in Gately Gardens who have all registered objections to the proposed development. I'm sure you're aware the whole cul-de-sac is objectionable, as are our 3 ward councillors and some residents of Woodcock Road whose property is back onto the property. In short, there are many senior citizens who have lived in here for many years, and there's little doubt the proposed development would drastically affect their quality of life in terms of increased traffic, loss of privacy, light and safety. Also, there are many young children who both live and play and visit in the street. They will not be safe to continue to do so. We have a blind elderly parent who must be cared for 3 days a week in the street, and we've been informed that she will not be able to use the highway and pavements for reasons that I will mention later. And also, we have people who work night shift, and disruption during this building, which will be major, will cause disruption to that person. We're told this is a small development, but in relative area to the actual size, we would disagree with this. We think it will be imposing in character changing, making it out of character with the rest of the street, whatever building materials are used. Light issues have been dismissed, but we say they are serious. The light loss will be a major issue, not for direct neighbours, such as number 4, who is very concerned, but for those directly opposite in the streets whose houses will lose the direct sunlight offered to their front gardens and front rooms. These people, it is suggested, would have ancient lights rights to this illumination, and the blocking of light will change the character of the road very much for the worse. To parking, a major issue which has somewhat been brushed over in the report. Parking for 3 cars is stated to be enough to support this development. Anyone who has been down Gately Gardens will inform you how tight the road is, and especially the corner. If any visitors park on the road, they always block the pavement. It would be naive to think that there would not be more car parking on the road were this to go ahead. Including visitors, it would not be unfair to suggest that there could be 7 cars parked on the street at any one time. Emergency vehicles, especially something the size of a fire engine, are a very serious risk of not being able to access these properties were there to be an emergency. This isn't rocket science. If you've seen the narrowness of the road and the bend as it stands, already dust carts sometimes turn away and go back if something is parked in the corner, something we accept. I cannot stress how much of an issue this is, and the dangers highlighted are very real. Pedestrians, especially children and the elderly, will be unsafe, as will the vulnerable. In terms of environment, an area that has not been mentioned is the actual drainage and water system, which is creaking to the point where Angular Water has recently stated that our systems need flushing to prevent our water systems from being negatively affected. The drains already cannot take the load that is put upon them, and Angular Water are regularly called out to unblock these drains. I would like to draw the committee's attention to point 18 in the report, suggesting planning permission would not be required for people to build extensions in the road. I can inform the committee that I have been informed of a homeowner in the cul-de-sac who has refused permission to extend their property in a much smaller manner than it is being proposed today. With regard to human rights legislation, the report gives no explanation why it is not considered, and that the proposed development in how it's just not, it's glossed over really, to be honest. With further regard to legal matters, it is our understanding that the deeds of the house state that you cannot run a business on the property. We are unsure if that includes running a rental business on the property. The value reduction of the houses has been dismissed as not relevant. Given the age of some of the people in the cul-de-sac, it is relevant, as they will have to pay care fees consummate with the value of their homes. I have firsthand seen the anguish and the tears of these valued citizens of our city who have worked hard all their lives and chosen to live in a quiet, established area to see out their days, only to have their sanctuary and safety threatened by this proposal. Committee, the owner of number 4, who I represent today, is extremely worried and upset and is completely opposed to this proposal.
You need to wind up.
Yeah, I've got a very small bit left, thank you. The objectors understand the need for housing in the city. We really do. However, this proposal is completely unacceptable. The report concludes that this does not cause significant harm to the local area. That is wrong. It does. It was also suggested it will have a low impact on properties and residents of the cul-de-sac. That is wrong. It will. On behalf of my partner and the other residents who have asked me to represent on their behalf, I beg the committee to refuse this application today, and would very much like to thank the committee for hearing our objections and thank the 3 ward councillors who are supporting our cause.
Thank you. One of those councillors is here to speak. Councillor Kendrick.
Thank you, Chair.
3 minutes as well.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for allowing me to address this planning committee, of which once I had the honour to be a member of. Now, I think it's outrageous that we cannot take into account the fact that it's supposed to be a house in multiple occupation, due to the regulations passed by this government, because of course it will have an effect, as has been mentioned, upon the wider community. Instead, I will focus on the planning issue that I believe that this committee should reject this planning application, and that is loss of amenity to the property owners of number 4. The extension will turn the view from their side windows, so the 3 of them, will change from a wide vista to one that will be dominated by a wall so close that you can almost shake hands across it. Well, that might have been all right in 19th century Naples, but it's totally out of context with the neighbourhood of Gately Gardens. The side passageway of number 4, now an open and daylight passageway, will become a dark passage indeed. and I would urge refusal on this point. Now, I do appreciate and respect the abuse of the planning officer, but I too have had experience in planning. In fact, I was a first member of a planning committee in Hastings 35 years ago, and I've also been served as the chairman of the County Council's planning committee in the 1990s. And I have absolutely no doubt whatsoever that we have seen many applications which are far less egregious to the property owners in terms of loss of amenities than the one proposed. They have been refused. And I think if you were to actually look at the picture there, you can see how close the side wall will actually come to the neighbouring properties. And therefore I would ask this committee to reject this planning application on the grounds of loss of amenity to the neighbouring property. And I'd like to very much endorse the remarks that the previous speaker has also made. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you. Stone, did you want to come back on any points that's been raised by the two speakers?
Yes, thank you. So with regards to some of the issues raised, there's mention of parking. So the proposal is essentially a household planning application, so it's not an application for a change of use. And because of that, we're not able to formally consider impacts on parking. That could occur if we were looking at a change of use to a large-scale HMO, which is for 7 bedrooms or more. We did consult our transportation officer at the County Council, who provided some thoughts, but we're not duty-bound to act on those reports. So we have looked at this and considered it, but because we are looking at a change that is permitted development, we're not able to formally require or request those changes to be carried out. There was a couple of other points as well in relation to the impact on drainage and the value of neighbouring properties, and also restrictions that may be imposed by deeds relating to the property. All of those points, in terms of our assessment here, are non-material planning considerations, or non-material matters that we're not able to use to consider or to form our opinion as to whether something's acceptable or not. Drainage issues would have to be looked at directly with the water company. Things relating to deeds would be a legal matter, and value of properties is just a straightforward non-material planning consideration. With regard to the points raised about light and windows, just try and show you the views again that were useful. So this is the side of the immediate neighbouring property, number 4. So there are the 3 windows. As stated previously, this window, which would look directly towards the extension, currently faces directly onto the side of the neighbouring garage. So that's the view here. So the window is around this corner. So in terms of the level of change, yes, we acknowledge that there would now be a 2-storey bit of the building here, but I don't think that view is, I don't think the view is significantly altering to the extent that you're losing any significant outlook from there. The same, I think, could reasonably be argued of the side window to the rear, which actually, in terms of the change, the side window here would actually not particularly change, because it would not, so the rear building line of the proposed extension matches the building line of the subject property, so that view would largely remain the same. The more significant change, if you like, would be for the landing window, which would look across to the side elevation of the proposed extension. But again, in terms of outlook, the outlook currently is of the side elevation of the neighbouring property still. So in terms of our assessment of outlook and light to these rooms, we're acknowledging there is a change of the current situation, but we don't consider those changes to result in significant harm being caused to the residential amenity of the occupiers of number 4.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Can I just
Yes.
pick up on that? I think it's also true to say, Stephen, isn't it, that the windows that you've mentioned, the one to the front of the property is to the hallway?
Yes, that's right, yeah.
So it's the hallway and the landing window are to non-habitable rooms. The window at the back of the property, that's a secondary window to the kitchen, isn't it? Which, if you can show us the picture from the back, has quite a large, which I think you mentioned in your original presentation, has quite a large window to the back garden. So from a planning point of view, the assessment upon the impact of the amenity to that property must also be informed by the fact that 2 of the windows are to non-habitable rooms and 1 is a secondary window to another room that has another source of light. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions to the planning officer? Quite through. We'll start here and move around. Councillor Sands, Sue?
Okay, looking at that picture there, and thank you for putting that up because that's handy. It was mentioned about lack of sunlight for the people, I'm guessing, on the road, across the road from there. So that area there is blocked in. The lack of light for their houses, has that been a consideration? Because I know we do look at lack of amenities and lack of light. Yeah. I mean, I know that it's possible to do a reconstruction and to show where the sun comes and when the sun dips down and so forth. Has that been taken into consideration?
Yes, so I refer back to the block plan or the street layout plan, if you like. So this shows the application site. So the properties directly across the street. We don't consider that this would be significantly harmful. So there currently is, or there would be, the same distance that exists currently would remain. So the relationship with this property would be the same as the other ones on the south side of the street. So obviously if you're tracking the sun from east to west throughout the day, there will be some points of the day where overshadowing of the street and possibly even into the gardens of the neighbouring properties would occur. But that would be for relatively small parts of the day, and overall the dwellings on the opposite side of the road would continue to benefit from a good standard of residential amenity. So yes, there will be potentially some noticeable changes to the current situation, but we don't consider those changes would actually cause significant harm to the residential amenity of the occupants of the properties on the opposite side of the cul-de-sac.
Sorry to be picky. That doesn't actually answer my question. Was this actually something that, during the planning, when you were looking at it, is that something you actually used, software or whatever, to actually do? Did you actually, because I know it's available, because I've seen it before in other planning applications, did you actually do that to see exactly what kind of overshadowing there was going to be, how much light it was going to be, and how much it was going to affect the amenities of the people living across the cul-de-sac? Was that actually done? I appreciate that you can make a guess, but since it's been raised, I'm interested whether that was actually done.
No, that would require a detailed sunlight assessment to be provided by the applicant, so that hasn't been provided in this instance. So we didn't feel that was necessary as something that we would need to make an informed decision.
Can I just mention here, we obviously have a lot of experience dealing with overshadowing and reading sunlight reports, and from our experience, I would be very surprised if there's any impact whatsoever on those properties opposite. I would be surprised if there was even any overshadowing of their front gardens, and even if there were their front gardens, and they would perhaps, I'd be surprised if there was any, if there was, it's for an hour a day in a front garden, and it's not something that we would refuse an application on.
Sorry, I'm going to have a go as well. The other thing is that there's a considerable distance between the properties in question. I mean, there must be over 20 metres, Stephen, I would guess, across that road.
That sounds accurate, yes. Yeah.
The only difference really between what's there at the moment and what is proposed is that the bit over the garage, which is the thinner sliver of the site plan, becomes 2-storey rather than single-storey at the moment. Shadows that long would only normally be cast either very early in the morning or very late in the evening. So this, with the properties in question being immediately north of the application site, the longest shadows are going to be cast to the properties to the east and the west. So during even when the sun is at its lowest, which is at this time of year, the length of those shadows is unlikely to reach those properties. And even if it does, it's going to be for relatively short periods of time of the day. I think the main impact there is upon a loss of outlook rather than loss of daylight, because at the moment the people living opposite can see the sun and see the sky above the garage. They won't be able to do that in this instance, but I don't think that's a loss of daylight. I think that's a loss of outlook.
Councillor Moxhams?
Thank you, Chair. I certainly can't make this a condition, but perhaps a recommendation. Parking is obviously going to be a major concern. Can we make a recommendation that the front wall be removed to this property to make access to the front garden, which I note is already gravelled, so it's already turned over to potential parking? That would give access to the whole of the front yard quite easily, so that there'd be no need for on-street parking from whoever lives there. And my second question, I understand that development, if the words HMO had not been used, the development would have gone ahead with very little sort of potential objection. But as it is proposed as an HMO, should someone come back in the future and request adding additional bedrooms, would that then automatically come before planning, because it would be turning it in from a small HMO to potentially a large HMO?
Yes, so if further development was proposed to increase the number of bed spaces or the number of occupants of the dwelling, then it would be likely to require a formal change of use, which would take the use of the dwelling outside of a domestic use into a sui generis use class. So a full planning would be required for that, and it would be considered. And should that happen, issues such as parking would then be formally considered as part of the application. Also, there'd be a lot more in terms of scrutiny on the provision of amenity for the occupants of the dwelling and so on. At the moment, because it's a permitted change, these are changes that, as I was saying previously, the majority of dwellings across the city could do at any point without needing prior consent from the council. Indeed, pretty sure that nearly all of the houses in the cul-de-sac rather could build, for example, a small-scale single-storey extension, increase the number of bedrooms without needing permission. So there are lots of things that can happen that could lead to impacts that have been referred to as concerns. So yeah, if it was to increase, or if someone wanted to increase it in the future, then we'd almost certainly be needing to look at that formally. In terms of your first point, the transportation officer did make a recommendation that the wall could be removed and that parking could be increased. I think it also, I think it also suggested removal of the wall. Oh, sorry, required also an increase in the area of drop curb in front of the property. As I said before, that's something that we're not required to act upon. So whether or not we would be minded, or whether we're able to indeed add that as a condition, or something that we could do prior to giving consent, I'm not sure. I'd have to check with you guys.
So I think on that point we could communicate that to the applicant, and we could inform them that might be something that that they might want to consider doing if the number of occupants in the building is increasing. It wouldn't be a condition we'd impose, because we'd only be able to impose that if it was a result of the development that was being put before us, and the development being put before us is an extension to the house rather than the creation of a large HMO, as Steve's talked about. On your point, I think you mentioned that would this application come before committee if it were a conversion to a large HMO? And the answer to that is it would be dependent on the objections that were received at that point in time. The usual triggers for referral to committee would apply to that application. So it may be a delegated approval, it may come before committee, depending on comments received.
Councillor Davis.
We can make a recommendation, though, that the wall be removed. I know we can't condition it, but we can have that noted as a recommendation for the developer.
We could put an informative on the decision notice, potentially, that would just say please refer to the Transportation Officer's comments. These should be noted by the applicant.
I like that wall. Councillor Davis?
Thanks, Chair. I've just got a question about the nutrient neutrality and the addition of 2 further toilets into the property. Because this would come under permitted development, does that not apply in this case?
I'll pick that up. The short answer is no, it doesn't. Because from the calculations that are done from nutrient neutrality kind of look, and because it's still a householder, because it's still a household, they look at an average occupancy across all the dwellings within the catchment areas. So domestic extensions don't result in increases in the average occupancy levels in dwellings across the catchment area. So nutrient neutrality is not an issue.
Councillor Graham?
Thank you. A couple of points for clarification. The resident raised the issue about running a business. If it's an HMO as a business, can you just clarify whether that's relevant or not? I was also going to ask about the County Council advice, which I think you've more or less covered, but I'm not sure if the area is permit parking, and if we can limit the number of permits or the number of cars that can be parked there. I think actually if we removed that wall it would change the character rather more, but if we could, if there's a way of conditioning the absence of pavement parking, I think that would really help.
So the area is not covered by any parking controls. And just something that I've just thought to highlight actually. So in terms of parking, something that is a positive with the design, they've included a store to the front with an access door that can be used as a cycle store. So the Transportation Officer has put forward guidelines with relation to what they would usually require, and he hasn't mentioned it in this instance, but typically they would require covered and secure cycle storage. So that's something that is included within the proposal. So what was your first point? Sorry.
Oh, it's about business.
Business. Yeah. So again, that comes back to the point that this is a permitted change. So it's a dwelling essentially. It's a form of a residential dwelling. The use hasn't changed. It's not classed as a business in any way in that sense.
Sorry, can I just come back on that? I think the point made by one of the speakers was that they believe there's something in the deeds that prevents that. That's not a material planning consideration. That's a private consideration. But whether there isn't a change of use from a planning point of view. Whether renting the property out either as an HMO or as a standalone property amounts to a business, and whether that contradicts the deeds is not a material planning consideration.
Thank you. Could I ask you to just expand a little bit more on the advice from County that we can choose to take or leave?
So we consulted the Transportation Officer at the County Council, which we weren't actually required to in this instance. I think it's happened because it's referred to as an HMO, so as a normal trigger, that's something that we would do where a change of use is occurring, because we would be required to have their input. So as my colleagues have stated, because we're not formally considering that aspect of the proposal in terms of the change of use, which is permitted, we can only provide that as an informative, which is essentially suggesting a recommendation. So it wouldn't be a planning condition where we're requiring something to happen. We can put an informative within a decision that makes reference to the Transportation Officer's recommendations that the owner or the applicant could then choose to act upon, but we wouldn't be requiring them to carry out any works as such.
Councillor Sands, Sue?
We heard that in this road sort of historically other people had applied for applications for extensions that were refused by City Hall. I think I'm correct in saying that. Was there any kind of historical look at applications that had been refused in the past and why they had been refused?
I think the comment that was made earlier was that I think it was rather that extensions are permitted. So in terms of planning history, I'm not aware that there was anything of this scale that's been refused. There is a photograph that you can see of a dwelling a bit further along the road that has successfully extended their property in a vaguely similar style. So it's a two-story extension to the side. So there's no precedent being set with any other permissions in the past and so on.
If I may slightly insert, am I allowed to intercede, or just to give you some information about that?
No.
Okay, thank you.
I felt sorry about that. Stephen, anything else?
So we've obviously looked at the history of applications in the site, but there's nothing that is directly influencing this decision. The assessment is based on the individual merits of the proposal and the situation with this site in relation to its surroundings.
Sorry, can I just come back on that, Chair? I mean, Stephen's mentioned most of what I wanted to say, but I think that the point that the speaker picked up on the terminology and the language in paragraph 18 of the report. I think paragraph 18 is intended to it points one towards the fact that there are permitted development rights that exist for houses to be extended without planning permission, which could result in the creation of additional bedrooms. And that kind of comes back to the point that I know that members are wrestling with, is that the use of the property as an HMO is a form of permitted development. That permitted development could be facilitated by other forms of permitted development which allow extensions. I mean, even if you look at the layout of the existing unextended property, there are ways which you could increase the number of bedrooms within that without planning permission. You could, for example, convert the garage into additional living accommodation, which wouldn't require planning permission. So there are things that can happen without our ability to intervene and control. And I think that's where a lot of the issues about this case are coming from. The point about whether or not we can take into account the Highways Authority's comments also comes back to that point, because we can only apply conditions where they are relevant to the development for which planning permission is being sought. This is a planning application for an extension to a residential dwelling. So the requirements for additional car parking, because the change of use is permitted development, that's not something that we can actually attach conditions to, because they wouldn't meet the tests that we would, because it doesn't relate to the development for which consent is sought. Thank you.
Okay, I've got one more person, Councillor Davis.
Yeah, thanks. I just want to confirm to people watching that if there were no objections to this would automatically have gone through under permitted development, and should this be refused and it was reapplied for, would it go through under permitted development if there were no objections?
Well, the extension in itself requires consent. The only reason it's before you as a committee is because it was called in by members. Otherwise, it would have been determined under delegated authority in accordance with the scheme of delegation.
Okay, if there's no more questions to the officer, we'll move on to the recommendation, which is to approve, and I will move that. Have we got a seconder for that? Councillor Sands. Any discussion? Councillor Bergline.
So I think it's important that we explain to people who've come here, and also kind of pick up comments from Councillor Kendrick, because within the planning system, it's not that we don't appreciate concerns. It may not even be that we don't agree with what you don't like, but within the planning system, there are so little reasons on which we can legally refuse a planning application. So you've had officers sort of explain why we can't consider house prices, why we can't consider parking in this instance, why we can't. There's lots of things that we're not allowed to consider. So the only things that we're, in this case, as far as I'm concerned, that we're allowed to consider is really the amenity issues. And I don't have a shadow of a doubt that if we were to refuse this today, if it goes to appeal, it will be waved through straight away. So that's the next step would be applicants or their kind of like agents know what usually gets determined or approved, and then they know that they can just move straight to appeal. And there is just not enough grounds for us to justify this without it being then approved on appeal. Doesn't mean we like it, doesn't mean I like it, I can only speak for myself, but there is just not, in this instance, I cannot see any material planning considerations on which grounds I could refuse it that I don't think that would be immediately overturned on appeal.
Councillor Sands? Right.
Thank you, Chair. Just looking at the elevations of the proposed changes, they actually sort of look quite nice and add to the building. What I do object to is the fact that we're having a change in the nature of the building, turn it into an HMO. And as people would know, we've long had serious reservations about HMOs all around the city, and the HMO does change the nature of the neighbourhood, but unfortunately that's not, as Councillor Bodeline has already pointed out, not sufficient ground refusal. But I certainly would like to reiterate that I would like a strong recommendation that the developer does remove the front wall. I know it's not a condition, but I'd like a strong recommendation that the developer does remove the front wall to ameliorate any parking issues that may eventuate as a result of it being used as an HMO. As I said, I don't like the fact it's an HMO. It'd be far nicer if it was simply a family dwelling, but there's not much we can do about that at this stage.
Councillor Chairman.
As has been previously stated by other members, there isn't many things we can do about this, but it is interesting some of the comments which were made. And I would suggest that in Norwich we do have a significant issue with pavement parking and accessibility of residential areas, especially for infirm residents who are having difficulty. I've got residents in my area who can't access a pavement because of pavement parking. And this is a wider issue, and maybe not something for planning, but maybe something which is, which residents could raise further, which might not be specific to this dwelling and this application, but maybe something they might want to consider continuing to push, because I do think it's a very significant issue.
Anyone else? Councillor Susanz.
I would like to reiterate and agree with Councillor Sands here, as someone who lives in a small cul-de-sac with 5 HMOs within that small cul-de-sac. It does change the way that people live, and I'm hoping that this isn't the thin end of the wedge. Obviously we can't refuse it on those grounds, but I do think it's something that should be considered when looking at planning applications, and that the City Council needs to look closely at the extent of HMOs that are being forced upon us.
Thank you. If there's no one else wish to, Councillor Vaughan Thomas.
Thank you, Chair. The concerns that have been raised by the people who are objecting to it are real concerns, but unfortunately they're not concerns which trigger the planning considerations. I take away the things that you're raising, and the Councillor Champion and Councillor Birdline have raised. They are real, but they're much wider. They go right across the city, quite frankly. The parking issues, yes, it's huge. People have individual cars now. I mean, quite frankly, if I moved into that house with my family and 5 sons, you'd still have parking problems, quite frankly. It's a much wider issue. Your concerns are real, but I'm afraid they just don't trigger the planning aspect of it. So, consolation, really, that's all. I'm afraid there isn't an objection, and we'd end up going to an appeal. That'd be a pointless exercise, quite frankly.
Thank you. We'll move to the vote now, and no other person. Councillor Thomas.
I'd just like to endorse the previous comments that have been made. At least in this instance, there is room for parking in the front of the house. So I would hope that the wall is removed, although I understand that would change the aesthetic of the wall compared to the other gardens. But at least there is room for parking on the property, which would ameliorate some of the parking issues on the street. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we'll move to the bill. The recommendation is to approve. All those in favour, please show.
It looks like it's a
Martin.
recorded votes, Chair, please. So that's Councillor Driver, Councillor Bogerline, Councillor Champion, Councillor Sue Sands, Councillor Mike Sands, Councillor Viv Thomas, Councillor Vaughan Thomas, Councillor Davis and Councillor Graham.
All those against? Abstention? Thank you. Councillor Peake.
Councillor Peake is abstaining.
So that's been approved. Thank you. Can I recommend that we take 5 minutes for people to take a comfort break? Thank you. Item 4C, which is 44 York Street. And Laura's going to take us through this report. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Just before we start, I just want to draw your attention to the updates report, which refers to item 4C when talking about Dowding Road, which is the following application, not this one. So there are no updates for this application, just for clarity. The application relates to a property on York Street, number 44 York Street. So you'll see here the property is located on the north side of the street, and it is a traditional Norwich terrace, two-storey terrace dwelling. Here it is in a wider context. The application is for a dormer, and I'll just show you the existing plans to start with. As you can see, there is a single-storey rear extension on the back, but otherwise it is a traditional Norwich terrace with a roof slope on the back that you can see here, with the rear outcrop, as these terraces tend to have. So the application is for a dormer on the rear roof slope facing north. You can see a section here which shows the dormer in situ. And here you can see the rear roof slope just here with a zinc-clad dormer facing towards the rear of the site and a couple of Velux windows on the front. Here are some side elevations of one side and the other, which show how far the dormer would project. These are some photos of the site. Looking from the rear garden, you can see the single-storey rear extension in position here. This is the roof slope in question. And looking in the other direction, again, this is the roof slope in question. There's a Velux there at the moment. This would be the position of the zinc-clad rear dormer. Just to give an idea of the views that would be gained from this rear dormer, this is looking towards the garden of number 46 from the first floor. Obviously, the views from the extension, from the dormer, would be at a higher level, but nevertheless would be similar to this photo shown here. And looking in the other direction towards the garden of number 42. So these are the views that can already be gained from the rear of the property. In terms of the assessment of the application, the important thing to note here is that the dormer, in terms of its size, is permitted development. The only reason that the application is before us, and the reason that we are considering a planning application on the proposal, is because of the materials which are proposed. The permitted development rights require dormers to have materials which match the existing dwelling, and in this case, as I've said, the proposal is for a zinc-clad dormer extension. There are a variety of materials in the area and designs of dormers on various roof slopes, and it's not considered in this case that the material that is proposed would cause significant harm to the area. It's at the rear of the property. It will be viewed from neighbouring gardens, and in any case, zinc is a fairly high quality material that we wouldn't be objecting to in many circumstances. The application has attracted several objections. A lot of those objections relate to matters which we can't really consider because they relate to things like overlooking from the rear windows that would be on the dormer extension. As I've described, the views that can already be gained from rear windows of all of these properties, they do tend to look into each other's gardens, and there wouldn't be any significant additional overlooking as a result of the dormer. And as I've said, the dormer of that size could be constructed under permitted development rights anyway. The recommendation is to approve the planning application subject to the conditions listed in the report.
Councillor Sands? No. We've got a speaker.
Councillor Sands, did you not want to declare an interest in this item though, please?
Oh yes, on the previous item, the speaker for that item, I didn't realise it was someone I sort of know distantly. He's an officer in County Hall.
You mean this item?
The previous item. This item?
Yeah, this gentleman's here for...
Oh, you're not a county officer though, are you? No, this was the previous item. The speaker for the previous item is a county officer who's had some dealings with the Bowthorpe community workshops, of which I'm a trustee. I didn't realise I even knew him. It made no impact on my decision in any way, shape or form, but I just thought it needed to be declared for transparency.
Yep, thank you very much. We have got a speaker here, Councillor Oliver. We just got the one speaker?
Chair, we've also got the applicant, Mr Miles.
Okay, Councillor Oliver, you're first. And you have 3 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. So I understand that it's the view of the officers that we cannot refuse a development on the grounds of amenity, and I also note that the applicant and officers have worked together to reduce the impact of the development, and I also note that there's a bird box that's going to be installed, so I welcome that. I also would suggest that what's permitted might not always be what we believe is best for the area, and in the context of the size of the development in a built-up area, my view is that the use of zinc as an exceptional material might make more of a negative impact than you'd see on the smaller development, so I would like that to be considered.
Okay. Thank you. Nice and quick. We have the applicant here now, and you have 3 minutes as well. Thank you.
Okay, so I haven't prepared anything, apologies for that, but just for a bit of context, I think when the architect first proposed the original plans, they're quite ambitious, which I think raised a few eyebrows with the neighbours, and obviously in consultation with those and the planning committee, we revised the scheme to what it is now, in which I believe is within the grounds of the planning application. It's a 3-bedroom terrace, typical Norwich terrace as suggested. We have 3 children, 2 of them were sharing a room for a number of years, but there's a 7-year gap and the 2 girls sort of had enough of each other, which is why we went down this route. We're fully committed to the community and have lived in the house for nearly 15 years. We're currently utilising the front room as a 4th bedroom, which is not ideal. And this extension would obviously give us the room for the family to grow and make the house a reasonable size for the children. So hopefully with the revisions that have been made, it's acceptable. And to be honest, I didn't realise the zinc element of it was the sticking point. But you know, it is a modern material, but there's other houses within my road and other roads near the locality that have a similar finish, so I didn't think it would be an issue. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, did you want to come back on anything I said? No. Thank you. We move on to questions. Can I ask a question first?
Councillor Davis to leave, please.
I see that the door was going to have a flat roof. Can you get up on it?
I assume you'd need scaffolding to do so. What's the purpose of the question?
Because the picture you showed has had a floor part on the roof, so someone must be sitting out there in a flat piece. And I thought if you build a piece which is up even further, would they use the roof?
I think you're talking about this existing single-storey extension. These are actually in the rear garden, I think.
Okay. That's a good picture. That's the rear garden. Is it? I don't know, it's on the roof to me. My mistake. There you go. Any other questions? Councillor Sands, Mike.
Just one question. Looking at the diagram of the proposed dormer, and I'd like to be corrected if I'm wrong here, one of the windows looks full length, in which case, that if it is, that potentially could form essentially a Juliet balcony. And if that's the case, is there going to be some suitable safety balustrading there to prevent anyone from falling out of the window?
I would assume that there would need to be for building regulations, and I've just had a nod from the applicant that that would be the case.
Any other questions? Okay, we'll move on to the recommendation, which is to approve, and I'll move that. Seconder for that, Councillor Sue Sands. Discussion, anyone? Councillor Sands, Mike?
I had a look on Google Earth at the area a day or two ago, and I note that there are quite a number of similar dormer extensions in the area, most of which seem to be clad in white PVC, which sort of stands out quite significantly. This with the zinc cladding, zinc, as we know, weathers over time and will turn to a sort of a slate grey colour, which will blend in very well with the surrounding area. So I think the choice of materials is actually a very, very good one.
Thank you. No one else wishes to speak. We move to the recommendation, which is to approve. All those in favour, please show. That's unanimous. Thank you. So that's been passed. Thank you very much. And we move on to our last item.
Yeah, just go and get Councillor Davis.
Oh, yes. We just got to get Councillor Davis back in before we can move on. But our last one is 4D, 11 Downing Road. Okay, we're all ready. And Natasha will take us through the report. Thank you.
So the application is a householder application at 11 Dowding Road for 3 different elements. We've got a 2-storey side extension, a single-storey rear extension, and a rear dormer. So the property is a 2-storey detached dwelling house located northwest of Dowding Road. And Dowding Road is generally a residential area with a lot of large detached properties, and they're set on large plots. It's a picture of the front of the dwelling. The dwelling is made from buff brick with dark plain roof tiles, and generally the property has maintained its original form and has a front and rear garden. That's the existing plans. So the proposal is for 3 elements. We've got a single-storey, 2-storey side extension, and a rear dormer. For the single-storey extension, this would be made with buff brick to match the main dwelling, and it would also have a flat roof with a roof lantern and rear and side glazed aluminium doors. So here, this is the rear extension, and this would measure 4.5 meters deep, 6.5 meters wide, and 3.6 meters high. And then we've got the 2-storey side extension here,
and this would be a garage on the ground floor, and then we've got living accommodation on the first floor. And this as well would also use a matching materials to the dwelling, and would also have a pitched roof similar to that on the main dwelling. And this element of the extension has been amended during the process to reduce the scale and the impact it would have on the surrounding area. With the new amendments, this two-story extension would be measuring 4.6 meters deep, 5.1 meters wide, and 8.2 meters high. And then the last element, we've got a rear dormer loft conversion, which is here on the plans. And this would extend only the width of the main dwelling, and it would also have a flat roof and constructed using cedral board cladding. So during the assessment process, we received an objection, and in the objection they raised concerns relating to overlooking and over-dominance as well as loss of character, and most of these objections are for the two-story extension only. And there was also a concern with the material of the proposed dormer. Okay, again, front elevation of the property, and the proposed two-story extension would be here. So it's going to replace the existing outbuildings and garage. So here, just from a different angle, the two-story extension will be here. And on the image here, you can see that this is where the two-story extension will be going, and this is going to be set back from the front elevation by 0.2 meters, and also the height of the extension has been reduced by 0.1 meters, so it's going to be under the main roof line, and this has created a break in the roof line, so the view of the property has been broken up when you view the property from the side elevation, as well as by setting the extension back from the front elevation. We've now created a clear distinction between the original dwelling and the new extension. And we believe that these changes have made the two-story extension subservient to the main dwelling, and just made it a lot less disruptive to the original street pattern. This is an image of the neighboring property from the front side. And it's just a close-up of the garage where the two-story side extension is going, as well as just showing the relationship between where the two-story side extension would be and the neighboring property. Another significant change that has happened during the assessment was the reduction in the width of the extension. So this has now created a gap between the two-story side extension and the two-story main element of the neighboring property of 7 meters. And by reducing the width of the two-story side extension, the properties are now further away from each other, so it's not intrusive on the neighboring property. And if you consider the total reductions in the height, the width, as well as being set back from the front elevation, this makes the scale of the two-story extension a lot more sympathetic to the main dwelling as well as the neighboring property. And on the two-story side extension as well, there would be windows on the rear elevation on the first floor, and some of these windows would result in some overlooking into the garden of the neighboring property. And this overlooking is not considered to be significant harm to amenity because of the increased distance between the two properties. as well as on the side elevation of the proposed two-story, there isn't any side-facing windows, so there wouldn't be any direct overlooking with the side-facing windows on the neighbouring property. So the back of the subject property, looking onto the neighbouring property. And then we've got a single-story extension that is proposed for the rear. This is the rear of the property. So the single-story would be around this space here. This single-story extension is a reasonable scale compared to the plot size and the size of the dwelling. The extension will have a flat roof, and so we consider that this will not be taken away from the main dwelling. The design of the rear extension is to match that of the main dwelling, so using the same materials, as well as the extension will include a roof lantern and bifold doors on the side and rear elevation. Now, we don't consider that the rear extension will result in any harm to amenity by any means, because it does not overlook any neighbouring properties, as well as there won't be any overshadowing or outlook affecting any neighbouring properties. The rear extension will only take up a small area of the small garden, leaving sufficient outdoor amenity space for the occupiers. And also at the rear, we will have the rear dormer, and this will not be visible from the front elevation and only extends the length of the main dwelling. The rear dormer will have a flat roof, and it's going to be a white cedral boarding cladding, which is not consistent with the material on the main dwelling, but given that it's at the back where it's not really visible, it's not going to have much impact on the character of the area. And also from the back of the property, at the rear, we've got some trees at the back, which also obscure the view of the rear dormer, so the visibility of it is very limited, so the material being different from that of the main dwelling is not considered to be significant harm. And also other issues that we've had to consider during the assessment process is biodiversity and flooding. This site is known to have butts that pass through the site, and works within the roof area have the potential to impact on the birds nesting on the site. In the butt survey assessment that was proposed, it was found that blackbirds were nesting on the site, and this was so yeah, birds nesting were found here on this section of the property here, but there wasn't any bats found to be nesting on the property, although they do pass through the area. So we have recommended for the applicant to install 2 bed boxes, one of which must be integral to the building. And we've also encouraged that the applicant should also install bat boxes as well. And as part of the approval, we have added an informative advising the applicant that during the works, should they find any bats on site or other protected species, any works must be stopped and the appropriate measures must be implemented to protect those species. And then another matter we've also had to consider was flooding. The proposed works are going to increase the amount of hard surfaces on the property, and given that the area is within a critical drainage catchment, surface water is a slightly higher risk compared to other areas. So we have conditioned that the applicant should install surface water flooding mitigation measures. So this would be installing something like a water butt before the proposed scheme is in first use. And to conclude, we are recommending to approve the application subject to the recommended conditions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Could you tell us the reason why it's here at this meeting? I'm sure that was brought in by the
So,
head of planning.
the objection we received was from one of the council employees. So it was advised by the head of the department, David, that this case should be taken to committee just to be transparent.
Just to be clear on that, Chair, there's actually no... The scheme of delegation talks about applications made by council employees involved in the decision-making process. It doesn't actually talk about where there's a situation where a council employee involved in the decision-making has objected, but for the purposes of transparency, I consider it would be appropriate for the committee to hear the application as an employee has objected to it. Just whilst I'm speaking, just to clarify, the update report, which refers to 11 Dowding Road, bat boxes will be included in that condition 4, as well as bird boxes. Thank you.
Yep. Okay, any questions, anyone? Councillor Mike Sands.
Just to clarify, with the photograph you've got up there at the moment, which sort of shows a double garage, I'm assuming that the left-hand side belongs to the house that's out of the picture, and that one belongs to the house in the picture, and that will be demolished to allow for the extension. Is the way am I interpreting this right?
Yes, yeah, you're correct. So yeah, the garage would be demolished to make space for the two-story extension, and the other garage is for the neighbouring property.
No other questions? Well, the recommendation is to approve, and I'll move that. Have I got a second for that? Thank you. Councillor Sands. We move on to discussion. Discussion, anyone? Councillor Champion.
It could have been a question, I guess, but I was just going to ask about whether a water butt is sufficient mitigation if it's in an area of significant risk of flooding. Is that all that's required?
Given the scale of the extension, that is normally what we would recommend for an extension this size.
Just to mention that the condition that we've applied, it doesn't specify a water butt. It specifies that they need to submit details to deal with surface water drainage. So that's still up for discussion, and we're not determining at this point that a water butt is the appropriate way to deal with it.
Thank you. We'll move to the vote, and all those in favour of the recommendation, which is to approve, please show. And that's unanimous. Thank you very much. And that's the end of the meeting. Thank you. Don't forget Monday we've got your councillor, have we?